Hi, everyone. We are going to be speaking about Abdul Malik. He is the Umayyad leader who triumphed at the end of the Second Civil War in the early Muslim community. And ultimately, it's the changes that he brought about or were witnessed during his reign that ended up defining Islam as a separate religion and it basically brought to an end the broader ecumenical community of believers that had been around for the first century or so. Now, we're going to look at that process in multiple ways, including through a lot of art history in this lecture. Now, if you remember, Abdul Malik was the unlikely success, let's say, victor in the Second Civil War. That civil war started when Muawiyah, the Umayyad leader, died. His appointed successor, his son Yazid, was very unpopular, and so his reign was quickly challenged. Again, it was the first attempted succession of a father to a son. Then a variety of three-way civil war broke out between the son of Ali, so basically the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, a person named Ibn al-Zubayr, a very important early member of the community, and Abdul Malik, who ultimately ended up being the heir of the Umayyad dynasty through a different elder. Long story short, Abdul Malik wins, but in the process, the Prophet's grandson is killed. Mecca and Medina are basically destroyed. And there's a lot of rebuilding afterwards. And there's a great deal of lack of legitimacy after this very traumatic civil war. And as we'll look at, we're going to look at how the attempts of Abdul Malik to renew the empire, to renew the army, to change the religion, ended up defining Islam until today. So, as I said, Abdul Malik had a legitimacy problem. He was not even the son of Muawiyah. He was the son of a very old other member of the Umayyad clan called Marwan. And he had managed to beat the rest, but only after destroying Mecca and Medina, essentially. And so to re-establish his power and to create a new visual identity for his rule and to kind of respond to the claims made by people like Ibn al-Zubayr and Hussein, he established a set of new visual experiments in the public depiction of Islamic art and rule. Now, we're going to look at that in two ways: coinage and monumental buildings. Now, coins, as I pointed out before, are probably the most common piece of imagery a person in the pre-modern world, especially in the Middle East, would have encountered. Why is that? Because many people use coins in some sort of way. It's an easy way, in a reliable way, to stamp an image onto a piece of metal. And that metal is ultimately kept for a while and circulated. So a lot of people see it, and you can kind of get across a simple message in different ways through the usage of coins. Now, the coins that the early Islamic empire used were essentially Sasanian coins. So the Sasanian Empire was the empire that ruled in Iraq and Iran. It was headed by a Shah, an emperor. And this is the coin that existed right during right at the time of the expansions, the Islamic expansions and conquests. This is from Yazdegerd III, I think the last Sasanian emperor. Here we have a picture of him in a sort of headdress with wings on it. On the right, you have what seems to be a fire temple with two attendants. In this area, there should be, if I remember correctly, Pahlavi writing saying the name of the ruler, which would be Yazdegerd III, and a bit of writing here. Now, in the early Umayyad dynasty and under the Abu Bakr and Omar and Uthman and so forth, what you have is essentially a continuation of that coinage. Everyone was making coins based off of this model. And this includes Muawiyah, the person who took over the Islamic community after the first civil war. One of the things that he did is that he put his name in this coin. So if you look here, it says or I put Amir al-Mu'mineen, the commander of the believers, in Pahlavi script, not in Arabic script. I think here is a bit of Arabic Bismillah. But basically it keeps the same Sasanian emperor image and the same sort of fire temple attendant images here. So it's at that point they have not come up yet with a new iconography for coins. And then one of the reasons that coins become so important, not just because they're a simple way of sending a visual message across an empire, is that they ultimately also become associated with sovereignty, right? The way you show that you're a legitimate ruler, that you're ruling an area, is by minting your own coins and by having your name read out at the Friday sermon at the congregational mosques. The other thing you'll notice on these coins, by the way, is that here you have a little mark. This looks like a tamarbuta, something. Sometimes these little counter marks or marks are added to coins to kind of show that they are, that whoever's making them is now in charge or different. Now, Muawiyah makes the coin, but so does Ibn al-Zubayr. Ibn al-Zubayr was one of the contenders in the Second Civil War. He again also uses the same coin. He also marks Amir al-Mu'mineen here. Uses the similar imagery. And the same too with the Kharijis. The Kharijis, if you remember, the Khawarij, they are the group of ultra pietistic believers who believe that only God has say in our world, and it's not up to any Muslim leader to try to change the religion or tell other Muslims. And ultimately, needed Ali for away from the battle with Muawiyah and instead going to arbitration. Everyone, essentially, every version and group that claimed to have some sort of sovereignty, some sort of power to rule over an area, put out a coin. And they all used the basic same Sasanian model. Now, we're going to look at a different coin put out by Abdul Malik. Abdul Malik actually is experimented with multiple forms of coins. First thing you notice right away, there's no more Sasanian emperor. Instead, he tries out at the very beginning this sort of kind of what's called the standing Arab or standing caliph figure. And already here we have script in Arabic on this side, which says, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God. And then it should say, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. Then on the other side, you would have this weird pyramid with a big stick on it with an orb. What does that mean? It's not quite clear, but we're going to get to it right here. Then another coin that he tries, he basically gets rid of any figurative image, and all you have is, again, the Arabic script in the middle here. There is no God but God, or God has no equal. So, La ilaha illallah, wa la sharik lahu. So, and he has no equivalence. And here it says that another version, and he has no son, right? So, these are two radically different visions of what coinage should be, of the imagery that you're going to be sending out in this place. That said, Abdul Malik, before he arrived at this, he was experimenting in multiple ways. He was also playing with the traditional images of Sasanian coins. So here we have actually the Sasanian emperor coin, which should be now filled with not Sasanian Pahlavi script, but Arabic script in the middle, and then also Arabic script around the edge. On the other side, again, you go this sort of standing Arab, standing caliph figure, which seems supposed to represent Malik himself, or possibly the prophet, but it's very unclear. But what we see here is basically a set of experimentation, right? He's adding text, he's switching the text around. He's, on the one hand, keeping the image of the Sasanian emperor, not probably because they thought they were themselves as Sasanians, but that was just like, that's what you keep on a coin, right? So if you were to create your own currency today, if you were in charge of a kingdom built off of the remnants of the United States, you'd probably still keep the dollar, and you'd probably keep maybe some presidents on there for a while, until after a while there would be a need to reinvent it and change the imagery again. This is what's happening here. They're just keeping the imagery because coins are supposed to have an image of an emperor, even if you don't think of this as emperor, but you wouldn't recognize it as a legitimate coin if you didn't see this. And he's playing around on the other side, putting in this figure. Now, if you remember, there's not just Sasanian coins, but there's also Byzantine coins. Keep in mind this weird thing, this kind of pyramid with the stick and the ball here. What is going on in this section? Well, what this is probably doing is referring back to a coin that was circulating in the Byzantine Empire, and therefore would also be circulating in the new Islamic world, where you would have, I can't remember, the Byzantine emperor or three holy figures on one side, and on the other side you would have the cross on this sort of pyramid that's supposed to represent the Trinity, I think with the three aspects of the cross. Now the Umayyads, again, take that coinage and just adapt it. As you can see here, they take off the crowns, they put, looks like turbans on it, or some other sort of hat. And specifically, they take apart the Trinity, right? So this one stick figure is an adaptation of the cross, in which the cross is no longer present, and it sort of emphasizes the fact that there is no Trinity. God does not have three aspects. God has only one aspect, right? So it's a specific rejection of Christian theology. And on the side here, again, we have in Arabic script, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. Other things that are putting, where is Abdul Malik getting these ideas from? Some of them he's pulling off of other contenders for the throne. So Ibn al-Zubayr, the contender that he's fighting with in Medina, was actually the very first one to use Arabic script in these coins and actually to mention Muhammad on the coinage. He's just taken a step further in defining an entirely new coin. And ultimately, the coin he settles on is this aniconic coin. Iconic means with images, an icon. Aniconic means without images or anti-image, right? And that is what he comes with to essentially create a new visual message, to codify a new type of public imagery for the Islamic Empire. And here he puts three messages on these coins. He says, there is no God but God. He has no associate. So, Allah ilaha illallah, la sharik lahu, what you would see here. And again, this is heavy emphasis on monotheism and the fact that there is no multiple aspects of God. And this is said even clearer. He said, God the one, God the eternal. He did not beget and was not begotten, right? So he has no son. There's no Jesus as a God. And there's no like unto him. And third part, Muhammad is the messenger of God, whom he sent with guidance and the religion of truth, that he might make it prevail over all religions, even if the associators are averse. So here we have actually, I think, a Quranic quote, or at least what do we call it? A epitome of belief. So Muhammad's the messenger of God. He has a guidance. He has a scripture that he's sending with it. The religion is truth, and he's supposed to prevail over other religions, right? So there's a difference between Muhammad's religion and those other ones like Judaism and Christianity, and of course, other forms of polytheism. Now, coins, I think, show the shift towards a heavier emphasis on monotheism, on defining themselves against Christianity, and the importance of breaking with previous imagery that existed in the Byzantine and Sasanian realms. So whereas the Byzantine coins were, of course, always centered, and the Sasanian ones on an image, the image of the emperor, the image of the Byzantine emperor or the Sasanian emperor. Here we have no visual images, and this comes to define Islamic visual culture, right? The purposeful rejection of figurative images in public spaces and public messages. So with a coin or with monumental buildings, we're not going to have large pictures of faces. We're not going to commemorate individuals, but we saw just how Abdel Malik was actually playing around with it, even possibly putting his own image onto the coin in the standing caliph part. The other major thing that he undertook is a monumental building that is still standing today called the Dome of the Rock, Kubat al-Sahra, which literally means dome over the rock in Arabic. This is the first monumental Islamic building. So, of course, there was a mosque in Medina that the Prophet Muhammad held meetings in and adjudicated everything. But this wasn't, one, it doesn't survive, and two, we don't actually know exactly architecturally what it contained and how. This is the Dome of the Rock, though, is a building from 692, and with the exception of the tile work here, which was updated by the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman, it retains a lot of original features. One of the things you'll notice right away, it's a weird building. It's an octagonal building, and on top of it is a dome. It is not a mosque. It is instead, as you can see here, it's octagonal. I don't know what you would call this, but the area around it has an octagonal section and then a dome over the central part. Over that dome, which you can see here, which is covered in very nice mosaic imagery and work. And this is all original mosaic. I think on the top is, don't remember if this is, I don't think this is original, but also the marble and so forth is original. But you have these beautiful mosaics built with gold and other beautiful colors. Green and gold is the predominant section. And what you have is vegetal scrolls, basically kind of plants vining around in different ways. And this whole building is over a rock, right? That's what the Dome of the Rock is, over this rock, which is commemorated here. Now, where is it and why was it built there? One thing to keep in mind is that this monumental building was not built in Mecca. It was not built in Medina, which was the traditional center. It wasn't built in Damascus, which was the capital. Instead, it was built in Jerusalem. Now, why Jerusalem? Jerusalem, because it was thought that the end of times was coming, and it was going to happen in Jerusalem, and most likely it was going to happen on the space of the old temple of the Jews, the so-called Temple Mount, right? So if you look at why right-wing Jewish settlers are constantly trying to take over and destroy the Dome of the Rock and rebuild the temple there, it's because this is part of or at least where the original temple of Solomon or the other ancient Jews was, supposedly. And in this period, when the Muslims conquered Jerusalem, it wasn't being used. In fact, it was being used as a rubbish dump, probably as a specific form of insult by Christians towards a Jewish site. But the Muslims, as ecumenical believers, but also as believers in the end of times, wanted to revive the site as a space of for the coming of the end of the times. This would be the moment where the day of judgment would occur. In later tradition, that rock is also associated with another aspect of the prophetic biography, in which the Prophet Muhammad, upon his sturdy steed, Burak, which also has the head of an angel, is lifted into heaven and travels in the course of a night up into the highest heavens, witnesses God, and then comes back down. That journey, the night journey, is called the Isra. He also Again, this goes from Mecca to Jerusalem. So he's in Mecca. He takes the night journey to Jerusalem. There he ascends to heaven, the Miraj. Then he comes back down. This happens in the so-called Laylat al-Qadr, and it becomes an important space of Muslim ritual in general until today. So it kind of eventually this narrative connects the two spaces, the Haram, the mosque, basically the Kaaba in Mecca, to the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. But this again is a later addition to the narrative about the Dome of the Rock. Here again is the depiction from a Safavid manuscript of the ascension, or maybe it's Timurid. But you have a very beautiful thing, and here's Burak, the celestial steed, and here's the Prophet Muhammad ascending. You might ask yourself, why is this image, this artistry, so figurative? Why do we have all these depictions of angels and even the Prophet Muhammad here? Well, one of the interesting things is that often in private contexts, so in illustrations that were meant to be kept in books, that were often meant to circulate only for royalty, etc., and an illustration like this would be a very, very expensive object. It was very common to have figurative depictions. You could even depict the Prophet Muhammad with his face. Here, the face is veiled. But in public displays, so in mosques and so forth, there was an increasing tendency away from figurative representation, though as we'll see, if we look in private spaces of the Umayyads, such as their palaces and Hanti lodges, there is actually a lot of figurative representation. Now, what kind of building is it? It's a weird building, the Dome of the Rock. If you remember, it's basically an octagonal space with a dome over a rock. And this building form basically takes the structure from Roman buildings that had existed around the Middle East, called a martyrium. It was basically a sort of octagonal church where you have a dome over an octagonal space like this. This is one that's standing today, San Stefano Rotondo in Rome. And there was the Prophet Muhammad, or let's say Abd al-Malik, did not need to go to Rome to see this. In fact, in Caesarea, close by, there was actually already a church on that model. And in fact, in the middle of it was a rock itself. This is the Kathisma church, which does not, only the remnants remain, but basically had a very similar structure. There was a platform, then on top of that was built an octagonal structure, and on top of that was a giant dome. In the Kathisma church, which we talked about briefly before, we see multiple things. One is the octagonal structure and the same dome structure, but we also find a rock. So the rock is the center. I can't remember what exactly the rock meant in this church. This was also an important place because it was one of those churches that Muslims integrated a prayer niche or mihrab into it. So it was one of the early churches that was being used simultaneously as a space of Christian worship and of believer or Muslim worship in the larger ecumenical community at the time. And if you were to look at these different chapels, you can even find different mosaics, remnants of which have remained. And this is the type of mosaics which, this is what you would find in the Church of Kathisma. And this is precisely the same type of decoration that would be adapted for the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Now, where are they getting these mosaics from? They're actually hiring Byzantine Christian craftsmen to make them. And at this point, you can still find Byzantine mosaic, very high quality Byzantine mosaics made throughout the former Byzantine realms. For some reason, mosaics were specifically particularly developed form of art in this period. And one of the most amazing ones is the former Byzantine palace, the floors of which you can see in Istanbul today. If you go to the Mosaic Museum, which is close to the Blue Mosque, and you can find these amazing images of people feeding donkeys and elephants, et cetera, and vegetal scrolls like this. Now, similar craftsmen who obviously knew what they were doing, were brought in to build the Dome of the Rock. And in all likelihood, these craftsmen were Christian, and they might have even come from the Byzantine Empire itself. And they were told to build this first monumental Muslim building. One thing you'll notice right away from the mosaic, so again, there's no images of humans or animals. There are no figurative images here. Instead, we have vegetal images, right? So plants, scroll work, etc., which will eventually become more abstracted over time. And then we have inscriptions across in this mosaic. And this is the first time that the Quran is used as a public text. Remember, the Quran, for the first, let's say, 30 to 40 years, was not even a written text. It was something that was, if written down, just written down in pieces. It was instead passed around by people who often recited it and memorized it. And then it was consolidated by Uthman. But this is at this point, we start seeing the Quran and its words being used as public text to specifically mark a Muslim building. Now, what are the themes in these inscriptions? Most of which come from the Quran. One is that is the importance of monotheism, and there's an additional part here that Muhammad is God's prophet. So he says, there's no God except God alone. He has no partner, right? So there's no Trinity, as in Christianity. Muhammad is God's servant and his apostle. This emphasis on Muhammad and the fact that he is the new he is the messenger and prophet of God is something that is quite new in this period, and it is used to differentiate Islam now from Christianity and Judaism, and to kind of break apart the earlier believer community that existed. Two, the other important theme here is that the importance of the Day of Judgment, right? So there's a lot of quotations about the Day of Judgment. So he'll gather them all to himself, that is, on the Day of Judgment. Muhammad is the apostle of God, or the messenger of God. May God bless him and accept his intercession on the day of resurrection on behalf of his community. So again, this place is meant to be a sort of staging area for the end of times. And finally, there's a very strong anti-Trinitarian, anti-Christian message here, in which Christianity theologically is formally rejected at this point. So he says, "Oh, people of the book, do not exaggerate in your religion and speak of God only the truth. The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was only the apostle of God in his word, which he cast onto Mary, and a spirit from him." What does that mean? Basically, Jesus is not the son of God. He is not an extension of God. He is just a messenger or apostle, just like Muhammad, just like all the other messengers. And Muhammad is ultimately the last one, right? So believe in God and his apostles, and do not say three. So very strong anti-Trinitarian message. Desist. It's better for you. God is one deity only. He's above having a son. It was not for God to take a son. Glory be to him. So this is probably the most clear and strong public message revoking the Trinity in Christianity, and built upon a city that had been, central to Christianity and to Judaism before. So why was ultimately the Dome of the Rock built? We still don't have exactly a clear clue. We do have the kind of messages it was meant to send, but what spurred Abd al-Malik to build it, about 10 years into his reign? One, I think, is the question of the legitimacy of starting a new capital in Damascus, and the fact that he had to vie with Ibn al-Zubayr, who was based in Mecca and Medina. If you remember, in the process of the Second Civil War, Medina was basically destroyed by Yazid. Mecca was laid siege to, and then eventually laid siege to again by Abd al-Malik. In that process, the Kaaba was destroyed, I think, heavily damaged, and ultimately Abd al-Malik destroyed it and rebuilt it. Now, the Kaaba here is a symbol of a high legitimacy. It's a very still an important place. It was an important place back then. And for Abdul Malik, building a new monumental building in Jerusalem was a sort of way of competing with the legitimacy of Ibn al-Zubayr. Theory two is that the place is meant to show superiority over Christianity, right? So it's a moment in which the ecumenical community that defined the believer movement before is going away. Now there's very clear differentiation between Islam and Christianity. And one of the ways to do it is to adapt the very forms of Christianity and to kind of show that you're doing something new. And we saw this already with the coins, right? The Christian message in the Byzantine coins was changed and transformed, but the same thing is happening with the Dome of the Rock. They're taking a very well-known major church, the Church of Kathisma, and reinventing it as a Muslim space, right? So all the Christian symbols are taken away. The mosaics are different. Again, the coins are different. And ultimately, it's no longer a church. It's a space for the end of times and to send an anti-Christian or message, at least a message differentiating Islam from Christianity. And remember, this is the same type of thing that we saw in the Byzantine coins that were adapted by Abdul Malik and the Umayyads. So the third theory is that the space is meant to be a paradise-like staging ground for the Day of Judgment. So on the Day of Judgment, God is going to resurrect everyone and judge everyone for their sins, and then the pious will be sent to heaven, and those who aren't will be sent to hell. And if you remember the idea that the Muslim community, the believer community, had to be pious in the expectation that God was going to judge them soon, was a real one, and that defined the boundaries of religious practice and of the community. And this place was meant to evoke paradise. So that's why all the plentiful greenery and vegetables, but also the massive amount of gold and luxuriousness in this place. It was a reminder of the reality of paradise, the reality of the Day of Judgment, and a reminder that one had to remain pious and pure to be part of this community. All of these two experiments, the coins and the Dome of the Rock, come to be spaces in which Islam is transformed into a separate religion, something that is much more similar to what we know today. Of course, a lot of that, the roots of it were already there in the Quran and during the time of the Prophet Muhammad. But the basic core beliefs are really defined during Abdul Malik's time. And there's other many major parts that get developed later on, we'll talk about. But I do want to introduce what is Islam under Abdul Malik. One of the things I think we can talk about here is that this means the end of a kind of ecumenical community. Remember, ecumenical means broad-based, open to everyone. And this is what we saw, at least according to Fred Donner, in the early Muslim community, that Jews and Christians were already part of this believer movement. There are some Jews and Christians who acted against the community, et cetera, and weren't part of it, obviously. But if they wanted to be part of the believers, they could, without necessarily formally converting to Islam. And instead, conversion was a process meant for polytheistic Arab nomads. Those people who converted became formally known as Muslims. And instead, believer, which was the most common term in the Quran, is put forth as the primary idea. By this point, believer is no longer the preferred word. Muslim is the term, and it's defined by people as people who believe in the Quran, believe that Muhammad is the prophet, and that Islam is distinct from other religions. So the idea that there wasn't a distinct Islam before, as separate from Christianity and Judaism, is now gone. Islam is its own religion. And the other important part is that Muhammad, the core part of being Muslim is believing that Muhammad is a prophet. And this, of course, makes it impossible for at least believing Jews and Christians to be part of this community, unless they want to formally convert to Islam. Two, as part of this emphasis on Muhammad's prophethood, and the Quran itself becomes a key aspect of the statement of faith. So the Shahada is what's called the witnessing, when you, by saying it, by declaring that there is no God but God, you join the community of believers. But now a second clause is added to it. It's not just there is no God but God, but Muhammad is the apostle of God, or the messenger of God, the prophet of God. So it's La ilaha illallah wa Muhammad Rasulullah, right? So by saying that 3 times, you convert in front of a group of people, you would convert to Islam. Now that second piece, again, becomes equally important as the first one. The importance of Muhammad is enshrined in the Shahada as a statement of faith. And again, this wasn't there before, and it counters the larger ecumenical community that was in the first century of Islam. Finally, the second thing is there's new Quran editions made. There's vowel markings on these Qurans. They're higher quality. So there's an attempt to further standardize the Quran to make sure that everyone's pronouncing it in the same way. And we could also see this in the coins, right? Often Muhammad, as we saw in the coins before, is mentioned in the coins directly, starting by Ibn al-Zubayr. And this becomes part of the Shahada. The whole Muhammad is the apostle or messenger of God is put onto the coins himself. And in the coins, we also see anti-Trinitarian messages like this, apart from the Surah Ikhlas. God is one, the Lord is refuge, Lord of refuge. He neither begets nor is begotten. So he has no son, nor is he a father. Then we also have hadith, which show this shift, right? So hadith are the words and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad that have been compiled by later Muslims. If those hadith have changed over time, and often they reflect the different priorities of the Muslim community at the time. So, for example, at this point we have 2 variant hadiths. The Prophet is asked, what is the best of works? What's the best thing you can do or know? In his response, there's 2 variants here. One is belief in God, jihad in the path of God. So you have to believe in God and you have to fight for God. The variant 2, though, says belief in God and his apostle. So you have to believe in God and in Muhammad, and you have to do jihad for God. So here again, we see Muhammad being fitted in to the orthodoxy of a new Islamic religion. Of course, Muhammad was important before, but he was not necessarily more than a political leader, and he was understood as a messenger, but perhaps you didn't have to understand him as the sole messenger of the believer community. Then we see this again most clearly in the aniconic coins of Abdul Malik. He says, there's no God but God alone. He has no associate, God the one, God the eternal, who did not beget and was not begotten. There's none like him. Right? This is from the Quran, Surah Ikhlas, which is again the Quranic message on public inscriptions. And again, here he said, he triumphs over other religions. So there's this new Islamic religion that is different from Judaism and Christianity, which are failures or corruptions of the original religion. Finally, and probably one of the most interesting things, is that he introduces a new title. Abdul Malik starts using the title Khalifat Allah from the Quran, instead of the traditional title used for the leader of the Muslim community, which is Amir al-Mu'mineen. So instead of commander or of the believers, he called himself Khalifa or Caliph. What is a Caliph, though? A Caliph has meanings and much broader meaning than just military leader of the believer community. He is an heir to the Prophet's authority. So he's not creating new prophecy, but he has the religious authority of the prophets. He is God's shadow on earth. He's a legislator, so he creates laws. He's a judge. He guides the community. He's also the warrior, so he's also leading them militarily. He creates rain. He leads the prayers of the community. He's the one in charge of the religious praxis of the community. And he might even be an editor of the Quran itself. So the Quran is sent down by the Prophet Muhammad, but the caliph is responsible for editing and transforming it into its authoritative form. And if you guys remember in this coin, one of Abdul Malik's experiments, he introduces this figure here. This is sometimes called the standing caliph coin because it's supposed to signify him as a caliph, as this new caliph figure who is bringing together all these different roles. And all of this again starts creating differences between Christianity and Islam and Judaism and Islam. There's not that many Jews around. There's a lot more Christians. And so what this means is that Christians themselves start writing refutations of Islam at this point. So up to this point, when Christians were mentioning the believer community, or Muslims are saying, you know, they're nomads. There's this guy Muhammad. They do raids, or they run this, they conquered this area. But they don't start thinking of them as a separate religion. But here we see Christians actually countering Islam as a religion, seeing it as a form of heresy and attacking its ideas, right? And this goes hand in hand with the differentiation of Islam from Christianity, as anti-Trinitarian ideas are emphasized, and Islam is distinguished from Christianity. And this ultimately leads to new spaces. So if you remember the Qatisma church, there's a Muslim prayer niche. These churches built at that time, they're integrating both Muslim and Christian prayer space. But at this point, there's new solely Muslim prayer spaces made for the Friday prayer. And there's a pulpit in them. It's called the minbar. In that Friday prayer, there's a sermon, the khutbah that is given. And in this new ritual space of Muslims, the jami, or the congregational mosque, this is where you would hold your 5 daily prayers. So at this point, you go from having 3 to 5 prayers to specifically 5 prayers. And as Islam becomes its own kind of religion, there is a new emphasis on the Prophet Muhammad. And because the Prophet Muhammad becomes more central, people are very much interested in collecting everything that he said and did to become the exemplar for the Muslims. And so this is why the very first biographies of the Prophet Muhammad are commissioned by Abdul Malik. And in these, you have a very clear distinction between Muslims and non-Muslims. Speaking of congregational mosques, new spaces that are being built by Muslims for Muslims, we have this interesting mosque in Damascus called the Umayyad Mosque. It's built by the son of Abdul Malik Walid, and it basically takes apart a basilica, which itself was in the space of a Roman temple. So basilicas are major churches, like the biggest churches you can imagine. They're actually based off of, I believe, Roman governors' palaces. So they're meant to convey spaces of rule in the Roman Empire as Christian buildings. And the Basilica of Damascus was torn down. And in its place, this gigantic mosque, the Umayyad Mosque, was built, which was built around a courtyard. Here it's seen in the panorama shot. And in it was again decorated in amazing mosaic work in green and gold, very much similar to what had been built at the Dome of the Rock. And in fact, this one is a bit more figurative. You don't have people, but at least you have houses, etc. Again, built by Byzantine craftsmen who are building these amazing mosaics throughout this area and place. Long story short, also, it wasn't just religious reforms. Abdul Malik is centralizing the army. He's developing a more professional army. centered around the Syrian core of the Islamic Empire. So what does that mean? Before, the army was essentially nomads, Arab nomads, who at this point, now we're in second or third generation, were being streamed from Arabia into the battles on the edges of the Islamic Empire. He now establishes a more professional army, more organized, built off of his troops in Syria. In that place, he also forces the nomadic soldiers to settle, so they can't just keep moving around, they can't keep raiding. He makes them sit down and live in the cities, often in the Amsar or the garrison towns, in which they were closest to. So it creates this settling of Arabs throughout the Middle East. And at this point, we have a shift to a new administrative language. Before, in Damascus, everyone was using Greek to run the empire, but now, after about 100 years after the conquests, Arabic has started to be used as the language of government. In some ways, this is easy because some of the Christians there already knew Arabic. There were Christian Arab tribes, etc. Most of the members of government are still Christians, but Arabic becomes more and more widespread and known. It can be used as an administrative language in place of Greek and in place of Persian. Finally, under the Umayyads, the Marwanid branch, the Islamic Empire kind of reaches its largest extent. This is the only real time where all of this area, all the Muslim spaces covered by Muslim are under the control of one dynasty, the Umayyads. Once the Umayyads are eliminated, Spain falls away. There's a break-off Umayyad dynasty here. But by 950, there's all sorts of semi-independent places. And by 1000, Egypt and many other parts are independent. So after 750, there's no longer a unified Islamic empire. There's instead multiple dynasties at play. But at this point, we have a gigantic space consisting of everything from Iberia and southern France to North Africa to all of Arabia, all of Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, the Caucasus, large parts of the Caucasus, Central Asia, and parts of what is called Sindh, so basically today Pakistan. An amazing expansion in the course of 100 years, something that almost had never been done before, with perhaps the exception of Alexander the Great, who went in a different direction. So keep that in mind, and we will talk more about the nature of Umayyad rule in future episodes. Thank you.